The silence hit me first, a thick, muffling blanket woven from snow and solitude. It was a welcome silence, though, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had become my life before the accident, before Sarah. Now, only the whisper of the wind through the pines and the occasional groan of the old cabin settled in the vast emptiness where her laughter used to echo. Blackwood National Park in winter was a different beast altogether. Gone were the summer throngs of hikers and campers, replaced by a profound stillness that felt both beautiful and a little menacing. The mountains, jagged and imposing even in the warmer months, now wore crowns of pristine white, their slopes draped in shadows that stretched long and skeletal in the weak winter sun. The caretaker's cabin was nestled in a small clearing, a sturdy log structure that had seen its share of winters. It was basic but warm enough with the wood-burning stove crackling merrily. The Park Service, after a somewhat cursory interview that focused more on my ability to handle isolation than my emotional state, had handed me the keys and a radio for emergencies, then promptly vanished, leaving me utterly alone. I'd come here seeking oblivion, a place where the sheer scale of nature could dwarf my own grief, make it feel less all-consuming. Sarah had loved the mountains, the untamed wilderness. Maybe, I'd thought, being surrounded by this raw beauty would somehow bring me closer to her memory. Instead, the beauty felt like a cruel mockery, a vibrant world continuing to spin while mine had fractured. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, settling in, and trying to establish some semblance of routine. I chopped firewood, shoveled paths through the ever-falling snow, and read by the firelight. The cabin was filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke, a comforting aroma that momentarily pushed back the persistent ache in my chest. I looked out at the endless expanse of white, the silent sentinels of the trees, and for fleeting moments, a fragile sense of peace settled within me. It was the peace of utter isolation, the kind that comes with knowing you are the only soul for miles. The routine, as simple as it was, began to feel like a lifeline. Wake with the pale dawn, stoke the fire, make coffee, and then venture out to clear the previous night's snowfall. It was during one of these morning excursions that I first noticed them. The snow had fallen heavily overnight, a pristine, untouched blanket covering everything. My own boot prints were the only marks leading away from the porch. But then I saw them, near the edge of the clearing, where the trees began their dense ascent. They were tracks, clearly defined in the fresh powder. Too large for a fox, I thought, their span easily twice the length of my hand. And the gait was odd. Instead of the neat four-pawed pattern of a canine, these seemed to have a dragging quality, as if something heavy had been pulled along. My first thought was a bear. Bears were known to roam these parts, though they were usually hibernating this deep into winter. But these tracks didn't look like bear tracks. They were more elongated, and the dragging mark was perplexing. I circled them cautiously, my breath misting in the cold air. There were no claw marks visible, which ruled out a bear for sure. Could it be a deer? Perhaps one with an unusual gait? But deer tracks were cloven, and these were not. Shrugging, I dismissed it. The wind could play tricks with the snow, creating odd shapes. Maybe a branch had been dragged by the wind, leaving an impression that looked like a footprint. My mind, still reeling from loss, was probably just overactive, finding patterns where none existed. I continued my work, the image of the strange tracks fading into the background of the snowy landscape. The days were short, the nights long and profoundly dark. Once the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, the temperature plummeted, and the forest became a realm of shadows and whispers. It was during one of these long nights, as I sat by the crackling fire with a book I couldn't quite focus on, that I heard it. A howl. I'd heard wolf howls before, a wild, mournful sound that spoke of the vastness of the wilderness. But this was different. This howl was deeper, more guttural, almost primal. It resonated through the stillness, vibrating in my chest. There was a mournful quality to it, yes, but also something else, something unsettling, almost angry. My hand instinctively tightened around the mug of tea I was holding. I strained my ears, listening intently. The howl came again, closer this time, seemingly from the woods just beyond the clearing. It wasn't a pack howl, the joyous chorus of wolves communicating across distances. This was a solitary cry, filled with an ache that mirrored my own, yet felt somehow wrong. I told myself it was just a wolf, perhaps one separated from its pack. The isolation was starting to get to me, making me project my own anxieties onto the sounds of the forest. But the unease lingered, a prickle of something cold running down my spine. I banked the fire higher, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and tried to lose myself in my book, but the sound of that lonely, guttural howl echoed in my mind long after it had faded into the night. The feeling started subtly, a sense of being watched, a prickling awareness at the back of my neck. When I was outside clearing snow or gathering firewood, I would catch fleeting glimpses of movement at the periphery of my vision. A dark shape between the trees, a flicker of something disappearing behind a snow-laden bush. Each time, when I turned my head to look directly, there was nothing there, just the silent, snow-covered forest. I told myself it was the play of light and shadow, the way the wind rustled the branches, my imagination running wild in the solitude. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if unseen eyes were following my every move, observing me from the depths of the woods. The feeling was most intense as dusk approached, when the shadows lengthened and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The cabin, which had initially felt like a sanctuary, now sometimes felt like a cage, surrounded by an unseen presence. The days were growing shorter, the darkness encroaching earlier each afternoon. The cabin felt increasingly isolated, a tiny speck of warmth and light in the vast cold wilderness. The strange tracks had reappeared after the last snowfall, this time closer to the cabin, near the woodpile, and the howls at night were becoming more frequent, sometimes sounding like they circled the clearing, a mournful lament echoing in the darkness. I started locking the door's windows religiously each night, a habit I hadn't felt the need for initially. A knot of dread was tightening in my stomach, a feeling that something was not right in the silent snowbound woods. Boredom, a creeping companion in the isolation, eventually drove me to explore the dusty bookshelves in the corner of the cabin. They were filled with an eclectic mix of field guides, old novels, and a collection of Park Service documents. It was among these that I found a stack of old park ranger reports, bound together with faded string. Curiosity piqued, I settled by the fire and began to read. Most of the reports were routine: trail maintenance, wildlife sightings, minor incidents with campers in the summer months. But as I delved deeper, I started to find entries that sent a chill down my spine. Yourself. There were reports of unexplained disappearances, hikers who had ventured off trail and never returned, their tracks simply vanishing in the snow. Some reports even detailed the disappearances of rangers themselves, seasoned professionals who knew the terrain like the back of their hand. In most cases, no bodies were ever found. The explanations offered in the reports were vague: accidents, getting lost, animal attacks, though the details often didn't quite fit. But there was an underlying current of unease, a sense that something else might be at play. One report, dated decades ago, mentioned local rumors of strange occurrences in the high mountains during the winter months, whispers of something ancient and malevolent. I closed the last report, the fire crackling loudly in the sudden silence. The disappearances, the lack of bodies, it all felt unsettlingly familiar to the feeling of being watched that had been growing within me. The vast, indifferent wilderness suddenly felt less beautiful and more threatening. The park ranger reports had stirred a disquiet within me, a sense that the isolation might not be my only companion out here. My gaze drifted back to the bookshelves, and I noticed a small, unassuming volume tucked away at the very bottom. It was a local history book, its cover faded and worn. I pulled it out and flipped through its pages, filled with tales of the early settlers, the logging history of the region, and the traditions of the Native American tribes who had once called this land home. It was in a chapter dedicated to local folklore that I found it, the legend of the Shadow Walker. The book described the Shadow Walker as a large, elusive being said to roam the high mountains during the long winter months. It was a creature of myth and legend, sometimes seen as a bad omen, a harbinger of misfortune or even death. The descriptions were vague and varied, some depicting it as a shadowy figure moving silently through the snow, others as a large, hunched beast with glowing eyes. The Native American legend spoke of it with a mixture of fear and respect, a powerful entity that was best left undisturbed. They believed it was connected to the spirits of the mountains, a guardian of the wild places. The book mentioned that sightings were rare, usually occurring during periods of extreme cold and isolation, when the veil between worlds was said to be thin. As I read, the pieces started to fall into place. The strange tracks, the deep guttural howl, the feeling of being watched. Could it all be connected to this ancient legend? My rational mind scoffed at the idea of a mythical creature, but a primal fear, buried deep within me, began to stir. The line between reality and perception was starting to blur. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of anxiety through me. The strange tracks had become a regular fixture around the cabin, appearing after each snowfall. They were no longer confined to the edge of the clearing. Now, they sometimes came right up to the porch, as if something had stood there, observing the cabin. The howls at night had also intensified. They were more frequent, and they definitely seemed to circle the cabin. I would lie in bed, the fire long since died down to embers, listening to the mournful cries echoing in the darkness, feeling a growing sense of dread. One particularly unsettling morning, I found a set of the strange tracks leading directly to the window of my bedroom. They stopped right beneath it, as if whatever had made them had stood there, looking in. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. My heart pounded in my chest, and a wave of irrational fear washed over me. I started taking precautions. I reinforced the door and window locks, placing heavy pieces of furniture against them at night. I kept a hatchet close by, even when I was inside the cabin. Every time I ventured outside, I scanned the surrounding woods, my senses on high alert. The isolation, which had initially felt like a refuge, now felt like a trap. I was alone, miles from anyone, and something was out there, watching me. The night was clear and bitingly cold. A full moon hung high in the inky sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the snow-covered landscape. I couldn't sleep. The oppressive feeling of being watched had reached a fever pitch. I sat by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out at the moonlit forest. The silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a frozen branch. Then I saw it. At the very edge of the forest, where the shadows were deepest, a large dark silhouette moved silently between the trees. It was hunched and massive, its form indistinct in the moonlight, but undeniably there. It paused for a moment, as if looking towards the cabin, and then melted back into the darkness. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was too large to be a deer, too bulky to be a wolf. The image from the local history book flashed in my mind. The Shadow Walker. Rational thought fled. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. I had seen it. I had seen the creature of legend. The feeling of being stalked, the strange tracks, the unsettling howls, it all made terrifying sense now. I was not alone in these woods. I was being watched by something ancient, something powerful, something monstrous. I scrambled back from the window, my mind racing. The image of the dark silhouette burned into my memory. The wilderness had revealed its true nature, and I was utterly vulnerable. The next morning, the fear from the previous night still clung to me like a shroud. I had barely slept, my mind filled with terrifying images of the Shadow Walker. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and gray, I forced myself to get up and face the day. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, a thin dusting that covered the previous tracks. As I stepped out onto the porch to begin clearing it, I noticed something different. Overlaid on the mysterious dragon tracks were another set of prints. These were clearly human boot prints, heavy and purposeful, the kind left by someone wearing thick winter boots. They led from the edge of the clearing towards the tree line and then back again, partially obscuring the strange tracks beneath. My initial fear began to give way to confusion. Human tracks? Who else would be out here in this remote part of the park in the dead of winter? The Park Service wouldn't be back until spring. As I followed the human tracks with my gaze, I heard a faint sound in the distance, a high-pitched whine that quickly faded away. It sounded like a snowmobile, but who would be using a snowmobile way out here? It was against park regulations to venture this deep into the wilderness with motorized vehicles during the winter month. A seed of doubt began to sprout in my mind. Could the strange tracks and the feeling of being watched have a more mundane explanation? The discovery of the human tracks had shifted my focus, replacing the fear of the supernatural with a more tangible unease. I spent the morning clearing the snow, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of the person who had left those tracks. Later that afternoon, as I was gathering firewood near the edge of the clearing, I noticed something else. Tucked beneath a snow-covered log was a discarded cigarette butt. It was a brand I didn't recognize. I hadn't smoked in years. The cigarette butt felt like a concrete piece of evidence confirming that someone else had indeed been here recently. And then, as I carried the firewood back to the cabin, I caught a faint smell in the air, a sharp, acrid odor that lingered for a moment before being carried away by the wind. It smelled like gasoline. My mind raced. The human tracks, the cigarette butt, the smell of gasoline. It all pointed to someone having been near the cabin while I was out. Initially, I had subconsciously linked these signs to the creature, imagining some sort of monstrous being that somehow used human tools. But the distinct boot prints made that explanation seem ridiculous. The possibility that I wasn't alone, that there was another human presence in these isolated woods, was both unsettling and strangely relieving. The fear of a mythical beast was terrifying in its unknowable nature. The fear of another person, while still potentially dangerous, was something I could at least try to understand. The night that followed was filled with a different kind of anxiety. I kept the hatchet close by, not out of fear of a shadowy monster, but out of apprehension about a potential human intruder. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin windows, but I heard no other sounds. Then, in the pre-dawn hours, I heard it again. The mournful howl, but this time it was different. It was closer, much closer than before, and it was interspersed with other sounds, whimpering, a low guttural growl that sounded more like pain than anger, and the distinct sound of something struggling, thrashing against the snow. My heart pounded in my chest. This didn't sound like the cry of a mythical creature. This sounded like an animal in distress. The mournful quality was still there, but now it was tinged with fear and agony. Driven by a sudden surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my heavy flashlight and a sturdy shovel. I had to investigate. Whatever was making that sound was clearly in trouble. I cautiously opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cold, dark morning. The faint glow of the rising sun on the horizon cast long, eerie shadows across the snow. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, my senses on high alert. Whimpering grew louder as I ventured deeper into the woods, towards the direction of the howls. The struggling sounds became more frantic, and then I saw it. Caught in an illegal snare trap, its massive frame tangled in a thick wire noose, was a wolverine. Not just any wolverine, but a truly enormous specimen, its thick, dark fur matted with snow and blood. The creature was clearly injured and terrified, its powerful muscles straining against the unyielding wire, its guttural cries filled with pain and fear. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. The strange tracks, the deep, mournful howls. It had all been this magnificent creature, trapped and suffering. The dragging gait of the tracks made sense now, the weight of the snare in the injured leg. The howls weren't the cries of a monster, but the desperate pleas of an animal in agony. My fear of the unknown vanished, replaced by a fierce determination to help this trapped creature. I approached cautiously, speaking in a low, soothing voice, trying to calm its frantic struggles. The wolverine, though clearly terrified, seemed to sense my intentions. Its struggles lessened slightly as I began to examine the snare, a cruel piece of wire digging deep into its leg. As I worked to carefully loosen the snare, trying not to further injure the already distressed wolverine, I heard the distinct sound of approaching snowmobiles. The sound grew louder quickly, the whine of their engines echoing through the quiet woods. 2 snowmobiles emerged from the trees, their headlights cutting through the dim morning light. 2 men were on them, dressed in heavy winter gear, each carrying a rifle slung over their shoulder. They looked angry, their faces grim. They spotted me almost immediately, kneeling beside the trapped wolverine. Their eyes narrowed and they exchanged a look. The relief I had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a new, more immediate sense of danger. The 2 men dismounted their snowmobiles, their rifles still held loosely in their hands. They approached me with a menacing air. "What the hell are you doing?" one of them growled, his voice rough and accusatory. He was a burly man with a thick beard and a scowl etched on his face. "I found this wolverine caught in a snare," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was trying to free it." The other man, younger and leaner, but with an equally hard look in his eyes, scoffed. "A likely story. You were probably trying to steal our catch." "Your catch?" I asked, my confusion turning to anger. "This is an illegal snare. You shouldn't be trapping in the park." Their expressions hardened. "Shut your mouth, old man," the first poacher snarled, taking a step closer. "This ain't your business. Now get out of here before you get hurt." I realized then that I had stumbled upon something dangerous. These men were illegal poachers, and they saw me as an unwelcome witness to their crime. The real threat in these woods wasn't a mythical creature. It was these ruthless men, willing to break the law and potentially harm anyone who stood in their way. As the poachers advanced, their threats becoming more explicit, the wolverine finally managed to wrench its leg free from the loosened snare. It was injured and wary, but its powerful frame was still formidable. For a moment, it just stood there, panting, its dark eyes flicking between me and the approaching men. Then, as if sensing the immediate danger, a primal instinct took over. It let out a ferocious roar, a guttural sound that echoed through the woods, and lunged at the burly poacher, who had been doing most of the talking. The poacher yelped in surprise and stumbled backward, dropping his rifle in the snow. The wolverine, though injured, was incredibly fast and agile. It swiped at the man with its sharp claws, drawing blood before the younger poacher managed to pull it away, yelling and struggling. The sudden chaos created a window of opportunity. The poachers were momentarily distracted by the enraged wolverine. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the dropped rifle, not knowing how to use it but hoping it would deter them, and turned and ran into the dense woods. The snow was deep, making the going difficult, but adrenaline coursed through my veins. I could hear the shouts of the poachers behind me, but the sounds of the struggling wolverine seemed to be keeping them occupied. I ran blindly, pushing through snow-laden branches, my lungs burning in the cold air. I knew I couldn't outrun them on foot forever. They had snowmobiles, but for now, I just needed to put as much distance between us as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally collapsed, breathless, behind a thicket of pines. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the wind whistling through the trees. I had managed to lose them, at least for now. I was injured. A sharp pain shot through my ankle, and my hands were scratched and bleeding. But I was alive. The long walk back to civilization had begun. I had no map, no compass, just a faint memory of the direction I had come from, and the will to survive. The wilderness, which had initially felt so menacing, now felt like my only ally, its vastness offering a chance to escape. The journey back was arduous and took the better part of the day. Exhausted and frostbitten, I finally stumbled upon a rarely used logging road and eventually made it to the park headquarters. The rangers were shocked to see me, especially in my disheveled state. I recounted everything that had happened, the strange tracks, the howls, the trapped wolverine, and the illegal poachers. They listened intently, their initial skepticism giving way to concern, as I showed them the scratches and bruises I had sustained. A search party was immediately dispatched, and thankfully, the poachers were apprehended later that day. The wolverine, though injured, was found alive and taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center. Its rescue became a local news story, highlighting the dangers of illegal trapping and the importance of protecting the park's wildlife. As for me, after giving my statement to the authorities, I sat by the fire in the ranger station, a mug of hot coffee warming my hands. The events of the past few weeks replayed in my mind. The fear of the unknown, the imagined monster in the shadows, had ultimately led me to a real and tangible danger. But in facing that danger, and in helping the trapped wolverine, something had shifted within me. The wilderness, I realized, wasn't a place of malevolent spirits, but a raw and powerful force, capable of both beauty and brutality. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, you could find allies, even in the form of a wild, ferocious creature fighting for its life. The memory of Sira still ached, but the all-consuming grief had lessened, replaced by a quiet sense of resilience. I had faced the darkness, both internal and external, and I had survived. The winter caretaker in Blackwood National Park had found not oblivion, but a strange and unexpected path towards healing and a fragile, newfound peace. The true threats, I had learned, often wore human faces, and the wilderness, in its untamed wisdom, held both danger and the possibility of unexpected grace. That was tonight's serving. If you're alone now, you weren't the whole time. Subscribe, and I'll meet you here again soon.